So as you've seen from previous videos, the aggregate supply curve is a little complicated in the sense that it can take three different forms depending on how the economy is doing. And we've seen various points in history that the curve has showed up in different ways. And so we're going to look at basically the classical viewpoint of aggregate supply and the Keynesian viewpoint of aggregate supply as demonstrated after the Great Depression. So a lot of this has to do with the shape of the aggregate supply curve in the short run and the long run. So in the long run, we already have learned that wages and resource prices will increase as price level increases. They are flexible, they are not sticky in the long run. So if you go back from an example in a previous video, we have a firm that has a total revenue of $100 and uses $80 of labor. So the profit is $20. So what happens in the long run if the price level doubles? So basically if there's an inflation of 100%. Well, now the total revenue is $200, but in the long run the workers demand higher wages to match prices, and so labor costs double to $160, and the profit is now $40. But real profits are unchanged. So if you go back to your understanding of inflation, if inflation is 100%, then the profit would double from 20 up here to 40. So real profit is unchanged in the long run. If real profit doesn't change, the firm has no incentive to increase output. So in the long run, price level increases, but GDP doesn't. So in that sense, in the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line at what economists would call full employment. Okay, we call this the trend line if we're looking at a business at the business cycle. And we always assume as economists that the economy will produce this amount at full employment. Okay. Now this will lead us into some interesting points. So here's where we get into the debates over aggregate supply. So the classical theory from as far back as Adam Smith has been this, that the aggregate supply curve is vertical and that changes in aggregate demand will not change output even in the short run because prices of resources and wages are very flexible. Aggregate supply is vertical, so aggregate demand can't increase without causing inflation. So let's analyze this a little bit. To break this down, what this is basically saying is that at all times an economy is producing basically along its production possibilities curve, if you go all the way back to module 1, but basically is producing as much as it can. And so if you stimulate the economy or you stimulate aggregate demand by increasing consumption, the only thing that will happen is prices will begin increasing. And as prices increase, wages will increase, and then eventually that will cause aggregate demand to fall back down. So to go further, recessions are caused by a fall in aggregate demand are temporary. So let's say let's assume that this happens. So aggregate demand falls, prices fall. That immediately means that businesses can hire workers at lower costs, okay? And the economy will fix itself because those lower costs will lead to cheaper products, which will increase aggregate demand back up to its former place, and that no government involvement is required. So basically just, there are short movements of aggregate demand, but aggregate supply does not change. Okay, that is the classical theory. The Keynesian theory, which comes about during the Great Depression, if you remember, he's the economist that that builds his fame by looking at the Great Depression. His belief is that a decrease in aggregate demand, a really big decrease, can lead to a persistent recession that may not end because price of resources and wages are not flexible, they're sticky. So here is what we would call the Keynesian range. Let me go back for a second. So if we start right here, you notice that this part of the aggregate supply curve is flat. And aggregate demand, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet here, is at full employment. So you can assume that before we begin the story, this economy is humming along. You know, it may be the 1920s. The factories are in full production. Everybody's producing a lot of goods. And then there's a massive decrease in aggregate demand. The stock market falls. The stock market crashes. People lose jobs. They stop spending money. Businesses stop investing, and aggregate demand falls significantly. What Keynes came to say is that sticky wages prevents wages from falling. And so what happens there is, instead of lowering wages, they just lay people off, but wages for the remaining people stay where they are, and thus aggregate demand does not increase back here, and aggregate supply does not move forward to bring us back to full employment. So what Keynes ends up saying is that some outside force needs to come in and stimulate aggregate demand to bring it back to full employment. And he chooses, obviously, the government to do that through spending programs. So if you're here, how do you increase it to there? Well, you might institute government programs like the CCC during the Great Depression or the WPA, getting money into people's hands. And what you notice here is if you stimulate aggregate demand, you do not see inflation because we are not yet close to full employment. So we do not see upward pressure on prices because the economy still is not functioning at full employment. When there's high unemployment, an increase in aggregate demand doesn't lead to higher prices until you get close to full employment, like at AD3. Now, we're gonna make that a little bit more understandable moving forward. We call this the ratchet effect, and a ratchet permits one to crank a tool forward but not backwards. And so like a ratchet, prices can easily move up but not down. So does deflation often occur? Well, not as often as inflation. Why? Well, if prices were to fall, the cost of resources must fall or firms would go out of business, right? That should make sense. If they're not getting as much for their products, then they can't pay as much for the resources or else they go bankrupt. But the cost of resources, especially wages and labor, rarely fall because of contracts, which I've discussed in the past. It really destroys worker morale to get a cut in your pay. And it costs money to change prices. Advertising new prices to consumers, repricing the inventory that you already have. So let's come back to the graph. We now have three ranges of the aggregate supply curve, which we talked about in the reading. In a depression or a very serious recession, we're in the Keynesian range, which means that you can increase aggregate demand and see no increase in inflation. In the intermediate range, we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, very similar to the basic aggregate supply curve that you've seen pictures of. Here, if you stimulate aggregate demand, you do see some increase in prices, but you also see some increase in production. And then you have the classical range, which means once you are at full employment, right here, QF, quantity at full employment, if you continue to stimulate aggregate demand, all you're going to see is inflation, because that economy cannot produce more goods because they are already at full employment. So if you give people more money or stimulate the economy in some way, they're just going to be competing with other people for the same amount of goods, which causes inflation. Okay. So to tell a little story and make it a little bit easier, here we have an economy at full employment. Aggregate demand meets aggregate supply. The Y stands for the national income or the real GDP. And let's assume for the sake of argument that this is an unemployment rate of 4%. Very similar to what we would have seen not only in the 1920s, but in our current time in 2017, 2018. And then the Great Depression hits. And aggregate demand falls to there. 28% unemployment, a heavy decrease in real GDP. So one thing that you can do is, oops, I apologize, let me go back. One thing that you can think about is that this bottom line, while representing real GDP, at the same time represents unemployment. So as real GDP gets smaller, unemployment gets bigger. So over here would be 30%, 35% unemployment, 50% unemployment, and so on. And as real GDP grows, obviously more people are working, and so you're working down from 28% down to 4% at full employment. So what if the economy is stimulated and we have a new aggregate demand curve right here? You might see that prices start to rise at about maybe 8% unemployment. Then you stimulate it again, and we do start to see some inflation at 6% unemployment right here. And you stimulate it again, and you might see some more inflation and some more production at 5% unemployment. And then once you get down to 4% unemployment, if you continue to try to stimulate aggregate demand by giving business tax cuts, by giving consumers tax cuts, or by asking the Treasury to spend money on government programs, all you see is inflation, and you see no more. You don't create any more actual real GDP or production. Okay, so hopefully that puts a little bit of what we've been talking about in some context, some historical context from the Great Depression and even from today.